strong patent is a patent that's defendable, where you've done your due diligence in terms of the claim scope being reasonable. It covers your primary market and your primary product. Having very broad patents often may seem great on paper, but they're also very difficult to validate, prosecute, expensive, and enhance the risk of invalidity during infringement proceedings. So it is very important for the commercialization team to work closely with the IP lawyers and IP attorneys to ensure that the commercial scope is something that is useful. I could get a very broad patent and feel very happy that I wrote something very broadly, but commercially it may be of little value to the end entity.
Hi there, and welcome to the next episode of That Product Market Fit Guy. My name's Steve Davis, and I'll be the host for this episode. And today we're going to talk all things IP. And it's my pleasure to introduce Andy Mukherji, who is a principal at Michael Buck IP. Welcome, Andy. Thanks for coming along and giving us the benefit of your wisdom today. So we'd like to sort of give everybody a bit of an overview of what IP is all about, and there's various questions I'll ask you as we go through here to sort of give people an idea of how it all works in the IP world. So probably the first thing is to start fairly generally here, Andy, just give people an overall idea of what types of IP protection there are. You know, what does IP mean, and what types of IP are there?
Thank you, Steve. So very broadly, there's two types of IP. One that is registrable, that you can register with various governments around the world. And then there's non-registrable IP, which is more like confidential information, your internal information, your documents, which you want to keep confidential. So that's broadly the two types of IP. I deal with registrable IP, mainly patents, designs, and trademarks to a lesser extent. And these IP rights don't just take effect automatically. They have to be registered with various jurisdictions around the world for them to be enforceable. And effectively, the registrable rights, in a very broad sense, are like a negative right. It stops others doing what you are doing and gives you a monopoly over what you're doing. So
Okay.
that's a very broad context
Great.
for it.
And today we will just concentrate on the registrable IP. We'll talk mainly about patents, but maybe briefly on trademarks as well as we go through. I guess the big question right from the beginning is, why patent or trademark? What's the purpose? What's the benefit of doing so?
When it comes to the question why, often the most important reason we have clients who do want to file a patent is that when they are conceiving a new product and bringing a new product to market, there's a lot of R&D research resources that go in to developing that product, and often the outcome can seem very easy to copy. But if it was copied very quickly, the company that invested all this money into developing a new product wouldn't get their return. So it's only fair. Over the years, the way the governments and the way the law has evolved is that it would be only fair to grant a limited monopoly for these innovators to do all this R&D, to invest all this money in developing the next game-changing drug or the next game-changing medical device. And in return for all their hard work, these companies or these individuals are granted a limited monopoly, and this limited monopoly is for 20 years. So that's basically the promise that the government or the patent office makes with the patent applicant. And in return, the patent applicant has to describe exactly how this invention works within the patent application. And my role as a patent attorney is to counsel clients when is the right time to file the patent, how to draft the patent, how to prosecute the patent, and how to derive value from the patent as well when there's a legal transaction happening in terms of ownership, licensing, things like that. So that's the field I play in.
Yeah. So the key word there, I think I heard, is protection. It's a way of protecting, your knowledge and your know-how. Basically, you can't protect everything. Obviously, it does need to be novel. We'll go into that in a bit more detail as we go through. But yeah, ideally, this is about protecting your IP. So So you did briefly mention the word when there as well. I guess we know why we want a patent, but when the next question is, well, when is the best time to patent? You don't really want to rush it necessarily too early, or you don't want to be too late either. So where do you see the balance there of advising people about when you should actually be patenting?
So the question of when is twofold. The first being, when is it legally permissible to file the patent? The earliest you can file, and I'll touch on that first. So you can only file a patent once you've actually conceived the invention and ideally reduced the invention to practice, or at least come to a point where you think it's reasonably uh, possible or probable that it can be reduced to practice. Sometimes the scale of the invention is such that you have to run simulations, and simulations might indicate that it is within the realm of being possible. So that's legally when you should be considering filing a patent. So to give you an example, if someone came to me and said, "Oh, I want to file a patent for a train that takes me to the moon," I don't quite know how it'll work. I don't even know if it will work, but can we file a patent for it anyway? And this sounds absurd, but we're seeing a lot of that with AI inventions as well, where the language models have not been built yet, but they already want to file a patent for the use case. We can't do that. And even if we wrote a patent, it would probably fall foul of the patenting requirements in terms of description and support. So that's the legal aspect of when is the earliest you can file a patent. Then it comes to strategy as well, because you might be in a position to file a patent, but there might be some merit in keeping it confidential until you're in a position where you can fund the whole process, and you can also acquire funds by way of investors, by way of partners, JV partners, to actually take the invention all the way down to practice and then make it commercially viable. So the law does allow you to keep things confidential, and while you keep it confidential, you can still do R&D and put it to practice. And in terms of timing, um, there is no perfect answer to when is the perfect time to file a patent, but you have to take commercial considerations into account, and that forms a lot of the strategy work that I provide to clients on when is it the right time to file a patent, depending on the various scenarios.
Yeah, and also there's the development cycle as well involved as you do it, because if you do it too early, as you develop the product, you're probably going to find new features that you didn't include in the patent, and then you've sort of gone off a little bit too early, sort of thing. So it's a bit of a balance, isn't it, between when you can legally do it, but when you really should do it, as you say, it's all based around the commercial strategy and trying to get ahead of the pack as well, which probably is a good segue into what the steps are in the process time-wise as you go. Like by that, I'm talking about, provisional versus followed by PCT and then national phase, if you want to explain that. And then we can talk about the ins and outs of provisionals, about when they're public, when they're not public.
So by and large, in fact, all jurisdictions around the world follow a first to file system, and most countries, most OECD countries, and most countries around the world, they follow a convention system. So if you are part of any of these convention countries, the first filing is key because that's what sets your filing date and your priority date. And being a first to file system, whoever plants their flag first gets rights to that particular idea or that invention. Provided, of course, everything else I explained, that it's actually a viable idea. It's not just a pie in the sky thought bubble. And once you file that first application, then the clock starts ticking and you get a 12-month period within which you are protected across the 170 plus countries around the world for a 12-month period. It's not unlimited. It does come to an end. And before that 12-month period ends, you have to make a decision on what countries you want to pursue. And that is a game of strategy again. It is a game of where your key markets are. No company files all over the world in every country. And it really depends on the product at that stage. And you need to surround yourself with commercially minded people to make a decision on what countries you want to pursue. Now, over the years, it was found by various countries around the world that the 12-month period often was not enough for companies to develop the product, crystallize the idea, and find investment, and then figure out what countries you want to protect the idea in and commercialize in. So then there was a patent convention treaty that was brought about by the WIPO, which is an arm of the United Nations, that essentially brought out the concept of a patent convention treaty application or an international patent application. What that does is it extends the 12-month period by a further 18 months. So you file an international patent application, you pay the fee, that government fee essentially gets distributed across all the countries using a very complicated formula, and it supports the patent offices around the world. And in return, the user of that system essentially gets extended rights in those 155 plus countries around the world for an additional period of 18 months. And it was found that total of 30 months or 2.5 years is probably the sweet spot where you can provide provisional rights to patent applicants without causing too much uncertainty in the market. Because the flip side is that you can't just give uncertain rights for an unlimited period of time. There has to be a cap because it has to be a fair system. So if a patent has been filed and it's been commercialized in some countries and not others, then the countries where it's not patented, it could be copied. And that's a fair call. People have had their chance to consider protection in those countries. So by and large, coming back to the question you asked, once you file the PCT at the 12-month mark, you get a further 18 months. Before that 18-month period ends, you need to then nationalize or file national phase applications in each country. Typically, in the life cycle of a patent application, that's the most expensive part and the most important part in some ways, where even though you're filing into those countries 2.5 years after you filed the first patent application, all the rights are retrospectively dated to your first filing date, and your major expenses are essentially delayed for that 2.5 period. So I often tell clients that it's a bit like buying a ticket to a possibility, because if you don't file the first application and you don't file the PCT, you have not got the opportunity to pursue that option in various countries. The PCT system enables you to do that. Of course, a lot of sophisticated companies who know exactly what markets they operate in don't use the PCT system, and they go straight into the
International.
key markets
Yeah.
of their choice because they don't want to spend that extra amount of money. They want certainty, and they are confident they operate in Japan, China, and four other countries. They'll just file there, and the PCT system may not be suitable for them. So you have options. The PCT is not the only way of pursuing international rights.
Yeah. I think, as you say, most of the smaller companies that I've ever dealt with will nearly always go a PCT route just to hold the door open and the options open for another 12 months while you continue developing and building commercial relations and that sort of thing.
The PCT system also importantly offers a searching step and a prosecution phase where you get a reasonably good indication of your prospects for success. So if and the scope of patent protection as well that might be available. And often that determines what countries you want to go in, or if at all you want to go ahead. Because you might think you might be able to get a very broad scope of monopoly, a very broad patent. The search indicates otherwise. And at that stage, you might think it's not worth pursuing such narrow protection, or it not may not be worth pursuing such narrow protection in so many countries. So often that is another reason why larger corporate entities still try and use the PCT system as a buffer.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess the other thing to point out to people is when things actually get published, because in the provisional stage, it still stays secret for that first 12 months, so nobody can access, nobody knows that you've actually filed it per se. But once you go into that PCT stage or beyond, or the national phase, then obviously it gets published, and then it becomes public domain, and people can see what you've done. So, I mean, I have seen people roll provisionals, if they make the call that they don't think anybody else is doing this, they need a bit more time, they want to delay costs, you can potentially roll the provisional again, but you obviously restart the clock on your priority date if you do that. That's the downside of doing that, right?
Yeah, and the key consideration is that they've kept the concept confidential
Hmm.
and not disclosed it publicly or sold product or taken orders. So that's key as well.
Yeah, and probably on that point, probably it's worth pointing out to people generally what does constitute public disclosure, because obviously once you have public disclosed something, you then sort of lose your rights to be able to protect it per se. So what does constitute public disclosure?
So it could be publication in a journal article, publication in some sort of a technical magazine. These days, social media disclosures, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, is all part of public disclosure. We're seeing more and more Instagram and YouTube videos being cited against applicants who have filed their patent applications. They never tell us that they did a blog or they got a review done prior to the filing of the patent, and often it's too late. Prior use is another aspect. So if a company has developed a product and they've offered it for sale, and during litigation it's discovered through discovery that they're actually taken orders for the product and shown samples confidentially, but they actually made a sale even though it wasn't produced, then that can constitute a public disclosure and prior use as well, which can be novelty destroying. Some countries, notably Australia, USA, New Zealand, do offer a grace period for self disclosures, but that's limited to 12 months. And that has to be used proactively. And there are some levers you need to pull at the time of filing the patent application on first instance. It's not something you or hide from your patent attorney, because otherwise if the filing is not made correctly, you may still not be able to avail the grace period provisions. So it is very important to be upfront and honest with your patent attorney. All communication is privileged and confidential so that they can advise you in the best possible way for your filing.
Yeah, it's something to be very. I've seen problems in particularly in university type environments where there's this rush to publish papers and things, and they'll rush off and do that, and all of a sudden, hey, it's been disclosed in a journal, and you can't now file a patent on it. So it's something to be very aware of, that you keep it secret until such time as you do get a priority to file it, right?
Yes.
Okay. Something else I wanted to get your views on, Andy, was in your view, what makes a good or a strong patent, as it were, as opposed to just keeping it trade secret? What are the attributes of a good patent, if you like, that's worth patenting? You obviously don't want it too narrow a scope, or people can design around it. But in your view, what makes a good patent, and when when should you just keep it a trade secret?
I wish there was like an easy answer for what makes a good patent or a strong patent. In my view, a good patent or a strong patent is a patent that meets the commercial objectives of the patent applicant at the time. So often I work with a lot of early stage companies that then transition to a mid stage level. New finances come in, new ventures invest, and often eventually they'll list on the stock exchange. So the priorities change as the life cycle of the product advances and the patent is going through various stages. But by and large, a strong patent is a patent that's defendable, where you've done your due diligence in terms of the claim scope being reasonable. It covers your primary market and your primary product. Having very broad patents often may seem great on paper, but they're also very difficult to validate, prosecute, expensive, and enhance the risk of invalidity during infringement proceedings. So it is very important for the commercialization team to work closely with the IP lawyers and IP attorneys to ensure that the commercial scope is something that is useful. I could get a very broad patent and feel very happy that I wrote something very broadly, but commercially it may be of little value to the end entity that is listed or that's invested money. And at every stage when companies are seeking investment, these patent portfolios go through due diligence. And a lot of what I've learned in the last 10 or 12 years has actually been through going through these due diligence cycles where there are companies that are trying to sell out to a US based big pharma company or a US VC firm, and there's double digit, triple digit million dollar amounts involved. They really look at everything, not just the patent, but also whether the product might be patented, but might be infringing a prior patent. Has a freedom to operate search being done? What's your strategy? Uh, how would you avoid it? All those questions need to be answered. A patent by itself alone is not strong, but a patent backed by good strategy and and good due diligence becomes very strong in the right hands. So in the past, I was exposed to some work done by intellectual ventures, for example. They would buy patent portfolios of individual inventors or smaller companies. And I could see the portfolios becoming a lot more valuable in their hands because they would then do all the rigorous work to make sure that the patents had the right scope, all the due diligence work had been done, the freedom to operate had been done, and then they would approach bigger players in the market who would then consider licensing those patents. So it's a very convoluted answer, but I hope it gives you the flavor of what I think is a strong pattern
Yeah,
or a
no, I
good
think I
pattern.
think what's coming through quite strongly, Andy, is the fact that a pattern's one thing, but it's probably not that useful unless it's really intimately worked into your commercial strategy. So the two have to be very strongly linked. Otherwise, the value is not generated. Um, Another thing would be useful for you to explain, especially once people do get into filing patents and they start seeing reports coming back from the patent offices, is this notion of difference between novelty and an inventive step. You'll often get something back from the from the office that say, yeah, these steps are all novel, but there's no inventive steps. It kind of almost sounds counterintuitive. Can you explain to the listeners what that actually means? What's the difference between novelty and an inventive step?
Sure. So with novelty, my favorite way of explaining this is some of the more old-fashioned people who would read a newspaper. At the back of the newspaper or magazine, there are these quizzes where they talk about spotting the difference. So there might be Popeye, and Popeye might be wearing a red hat in one, and the other one he might be wearing a checkered hat, and that's one difference. And there might be like three other differences. So that novelty is that. So you look at what was done before the filing date of the patent and what's been claimed in the patent, and then very broadly doing a comparison of what the new features are. So if you've got three new features, those are novel features, and those are the features that render novelty to the idea or the concept. So that is by and large the difference in features and the functionality that those features provide. Now, once you've got novelty, the second requirement is inventiveness or inventive step, also called non-obviousness. They all mean the same thing. Just because you're novel doesn't mean but that by itself would render inventiveness to the concept. I'll give you a simple example. You might have in the prior art, you might have two pieces of metal that are bonded together by some sort of adhesive. And then the patent talks about using a special kind of rivet that doesn't need that bonding. Now, that the feature of the rivet, provided no one else has come up with the rivet system, is novel. But the examiner might ask the question, that's all well and good, Dr. Mukherjee, that it is novel. What 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 good is it? Why is it important? Why is it different? And then is it we think it's obvious. Then it's the skill of the patent attorney to explain that no, the rivets, what they do is they actually provide localized extra protection in terms of strength characteristics, which the adhesives don't, because once there's a bit of mechanical pressure or mechanical failing at one point, it just starts running all the way through, whereas the rivets actually overcome that issue in certain applications, which is why we prefer to rivet rather than use bonding or adhesives, because it provides extra mechanical strength, or it may have various different characteristics. But typically in Australia, the test uses technical effect. If the novel feature provides an improved technical effect, then it is likely that the novel feature or the combination of novel features do render some level of inventiveness to the idea or the invention. I'm really simplifying it. There's,
Yeah.
there's a
No.
lot of legal concepts that go with it, but yeah, that's the overarching concept.
Yeah, no, thanks, Andy. That's useful. I think that makes a good distinction and makes it quite clear. On that whole issue of being inventive, so obviously you can't patent anything. It does have to be inventive, is what we're saying, to actually get through the system, and as it should be. Um, there is an option that you can have initial search reports done even when you find a private revisional. They're not hugely expensive, but in my view, they're very valuable to try and help flush out early on whether there's any issues with what you think is inventive. Do you follow that same philosophy, and do you advise your clients to go for those early search reports when they file?
We we obviously have clients with varied levels of sophistication and also varied levels of optimism. So we have some clients who have in-house IP teams and they have a good idea of the prior art base themselves. They themselves are, in some cases, they themselves are leaders in terms of patent filing. So they have a very good handle on what the prior art is and what advances are being made. Those are the easy ones. But even those companies often do initiate searches even prior to the filing, and even after filing, they'll get optional searching done by patent offices around the world. So Like we have clients who get the European Patent Office to do a search on some of our first filings because Europe is a key market for them. And if they have a indication of allowance or patentability from the European Patent Office really early in the piece, it helps them with their funding or it helps them getting approval for funding that particular project internally within that division. So they use it for that reason. In some instances, we use IP Australia's international type search system as well, which is an optional search system again. And the costs can vary depending on what option you choose and what regions you want to go into. Some of our clients who are very aggressive medical device filing clients, they file early in the US and use a track one searching system that can cost as much as ten to $15,000 early. But for them, having an indication of allowance and an indication of the available scope of patentability is commercially very important while they're inking deals and committing resources for regulatory approval, for testing, for committing research dollars. So yes, the patent searching is not just important to analyze whether a patent will be granted, but it's like a chain reaction that sets the tone for a lot of other steps as well in the commercial realm.
Mm. Okay, thanks. Thanks. We talked about the whole point of patents being protection, protecting your know-how and your ideas and things. Which sort of leads me on to okay, there's one thing to protect them, and then you've got to potentially defend them. Okay, so now I've heard people say, "Oh, look, is it really worth me bothering because I'm not going to be able to afford to defend it anyway? I won't be able to pay for the lawyers to defend it." What's your views on that? I mean, I don't think that's the whole story, obviously, because there's value to protecting it in the first place. But what do you say to people when they come to you and say that initially?
I think the first thing I say is often that the question of enforcement may not be a decision for you to make, especially if you've had investors invest in this and it's a multi-million dollar product in 5 years and no one has a crystal ball in front of them, but you won't even have the option. And secondly, if you're trying to raise capital or you're trying to turn it into a bigger outfit, what are the investors investing in if they don't have if they can't stop anyone else from running away with the idea and they don't get that exclusivity. So yeah, that is usually my comeback. I also tell them that you don't have an obligation to enforce. There have been times when uh, surprisingly the infringer is more commercially minded than the patent applicant. And we have had instances where we've let them rack up some sales, and our client just hasn't done well in the market for whatever reason, external to patent related issues. And once the damages are substantial, that's when we look at enforcement. Because at the end of the day, it's not a moral victory you're looking for damages and account of costs. So as long as there's good damages on the line, that's when it becomes more affordable. And litigation funding is coming into Australia as well. So that's another factor that you should take into account that if the infringement is substantial, patent applicants could have access to litigation funding. We've seen some informal litigation funders coming through the system in the last 5 years who've invested money. And I think as Australia becomes a more sophisticated IP-driven economy, there will be more litigation funding coming through, just like it's happened in the US.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I think the point you make is really good. It's the fact that you're not going to be the one necessarily that defends it first in the end anyway. You never set out to do that. So the whole point of having, as you say, a patent and that IP owned by you is under acquisition. It makes you an acquisition target for somebody else who has got the deep pockets to defend it. But you can also just most of these bigger companies these days are reasonably reputable. So if they are infringing, you can always send them a cease and desist letter just to make them aware of that, and that may actually stimulate them coming to try and do a deal with you to try and get you on board with your IP, right? So it's not
It's not a good look. It's not a good look for them.
no. So it's not necessarily you have to ever defend it. It's a tool for someone else to do so, and also it gives you leverage in commercial situations and negotiations, obviously, to move forward. So
Certainly.
yeah. So thanks, Andy. So the next thing was we've talked about the end of that process being the national phase, where eventually you do have to say, okay, which particular countries are we going to file in? I guess the question there is, how do you decide which countries to file in, and that comes back to the commercial strategy and where you're actually at, sort of thing. Yeah, where are your major markets? You can't cover everybody as a smaller company anyway. You certainly don't have the pockets to file everywhere, and nor should you really bother. So that comes back to making sure that you do. That links into this whole product market fit area where you do need to know your markets and understand where it makes most sense for you to actually file and do that. But the other question that may be worth sort of pointing out to people is, what does it mean in terms of selling and manufacturing? So, okay, you may file in a country, but what does that mean in terms of where you can sell, where you can manufacture, et cetera? So there's a distinction between those two, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so in our region, the most common question that comes up is, I'm doing my manufacturing in China, should I get protection in China? So my answer to that is, are you selling in China, or are you just manufacturing in China to sell back into Australia or Chile or countries where this product will be used for mining work, for example? And if that's your key market, what people often don't realize is that even if it's being manufactured in an external country and you've got a patent in the markets where you're selling the product, that should be your primary market. There are tactical advantages of having patents in countries where you're manufacturing as well, but I think if you're looking order of priority, I would definitely consider the key markets where you're selling the end product, because you can the demand for manufacturing is triggered by the sale. If you can stop the sale, then the manufacturing would come to a stop anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's where you want to sell into is the key takeaway for people, right? In terms of
Yeah.
ready for for which countries you select to file in. Okay.
And potential markets as well. Often you might have a licensing agreement in China, and if you have a really strong distributor with a very heavy presence who can enforce and who've got very, very well entrenched sales networks, and this has happened as well in the past where the client wasn't keen to file in China. And when I explained to them that, look, if you have potential distributors there, it might be worthwhile just filing it and leaving it there. And if you don't end up finding anyone, we can let it go. And he did find a distributor with deep pockets and with a big market share, and they enforce the patent as well and quite effectively within China. And there are ways in which you can enforce patents in China, provided you know how the game works there.
Okay, great. Yeah, look, we've been covering, obviously focused on patents here, and there's obviously lots more topics. It's a very complex area, this whole IP area we can look at in potentially in future episodes. But before we complete this one, it's probably worth just touching on trademarks, because we haven't really said too much about those. In general terms, about what the value of a trademark is and how that differs from a patent.
Yeah, so a trademark is basically a name or a sign of origin of goods, not the nature of the goods itself. So if I have a new pair of headphones, then and these headphones have some smart technology, and I call them um, I call them boggy, for example, and that's the name. Now, boggy is also good because I can hear sound even when I'm stuck in bog, when there's like high density mud, for example. That's the tech. If someone copies the actual device but calls it something else, they don't infringe the trademark, they infringe the patent. But if they copy just the name and start selling normal headphones, I can't sue them for patent infringement, but I can still sue them for trademark infringement because they are piggybacking off my reputation of calling my product boggy. And that's what a trademark does. Essentially, it gives an indication of origin of goods. And as you become a more established player in the market, your trademark becomes more valuable. So because you're investing all this money in marketing and building up reputation, you don't want someone else to use the same name and run away with your reputation, especially in a certain area of demand for a product or service. And that's what trademarks do. The other big distinction is trademarks can last forever. Patents only last for 20 years. Trademarks can last for 50 years, 60 years, and can be indefinite, whereas patent life comes to an end. You can't get an indefinite monopoly.
Yeah, I mean, trademarks can be incredibly commercially powerful too. Once you build a brand and a reputation, that's what you're protecting, basically, isn't it? So,
That's right.
yeah, there's all sorts of examples of that kind of thing, like Jim's Mowing and all those sorts of things, right? I mean, they're hugely well branded things these days that people can franchise.
And often people use it the combination as well. Like Maxtrax is a good example. They had patents for the Maxtrax recovery gear, but over 10 years they also got a trademark for the color. So even after the patent has run out, no one else can sell four-wheel drive recovery gear in orange. You'll see other colors, but orange is trademarked. So, and that's because they built up that reputation, and it's a specific orange. It's a very bright orange. So trademarks can be very, very lucrative, beneficial, and shouldn't be ignored in your overall arsenal.
Okay, great. All right, that's great, Andy. I think we've given people a lot of stuff to digest in this episode, and as I say, there's plenty more we can dig into going forward. But hopefully, that's given everybody a good general overview of what IP is all about and why you want to protect, when you want to protect. Probably the key takeaways, if we wrap up for now, would be don't patent too early. Make sure you do your due diligence and understand that you've got all the key details proven before you rush off and try and just file something, and really make sure it is intimately involved and combined with your commercial strategy when you start doing this kind of stuff. Be aware of public disclosure. I mean, people can fall into that trap quite easily. Be careful that you haven't disclosed it publicly, so that you keep your options open to carry on and protect it. And the key one, which is going back to making sure part of your commercial strategy, is you need to know your markets really well, because if you've got to make the right decisions about where to file, which countries, you really need to know where you're going to be selling and where your biggest markets are. So you do need to know your markets and understand them very well. Consider trademarks in your IP strategy, as you said quite nicely there towards the end. They're very useful. They're much less costly than the patenting route, but they can be very, very commercially valuable in your marketing and branding, right? As you go forward. And then I guess the last one I'll throw in there as a key closing remark is, if in doubt, ask a patent attorney like yourself, right? Have a discussion. And you guys mostly will offer a free, consultancy session, 30 to 45 minutes or whatever up front to discuss the possibilities and potential of what you're doing. Make sure you talk to a patent attorney before you sort of rush off and do anything silly. And also sort of, as we said before, make sure you're talking to your commercialization consultants as well, to make sure that it is fitting with your strategy and you've got the right strategy to use these patents and protections.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you summed it up really, really nicely. You ideally
Ideally,
want
want
all
all
stakeholders to
stakeholders.
be talking to each other from an early stage so that the end product is fit for purpose.
Yeah, great. Well, look, thanks very much for your time, Andy. Thanks everybody for listening. Make sure you like this episode and consider subscribing to that Product Market Fit Guy channel. There's a whole bunch of episodes already out covering a whole range of very, very important topics and useful topics for people building businesses or starting businesses, growing businesses. It's well worth listening. So please sign up and stay tuned for the next episodes coming out. Thank you very much. Thanks,
Thank you.
Andy.
Thanks.